Welcome back to Hardware Unboxed. Today we are taking our first look at the 16GB version of the much loved GeForce RTX 4060 Ti. I think that's the case anyway. You guys can't stop talking about your feelings towards the 4060 Ti, and I can't stop benchmarking it, so we must love it. Anyway, despite our fondness towards the RTX 4060 Ti, even I will admit just 8GB of VRAM, it's not quite enough for a $400 US graphics card in mid-2023. You'd really want 12GB as a minimum, I think, and ideally 16GB is really what it should have. Luckily enough though, Nvidia's had a bit of a think about it, and they agree. So they released a 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti. See? It's right here on the box, 16GB, and they're only charging a $100 premium. Actually, now that I say that out loud, $100 for an extra 8GB of VRAM, that does sound like a lot, especially when the card probably should have always had 16GB of VRAM. So why did the RTX 4060 Ti initially only come with 8GB of VRAM, and how has Nvidia managed to squeeze another 8GB in there for a total of 16? Well, before we find out, today's sponsor spot is brought to you by Hetzner. With hundreds of thousands of servers spread across several locations, Hetzner is one of the biggest European web hosts and data center operators. With their strong focus on sustainability, they offer high-performance dedicated servers in their server auction. There you can find different kinds of servers, even configured ones, at incredibly low prices without a setup fee or any minimum contract period. So you can save money while acting very sustainable. Hetzner offers a vast range of server products and at fantastic prices, so for more information, please check the link in the video description. Okay, so the problem, as it so often is the piddly 128-bit wide memory bus. You see, GDDR6 memory chips require a 32-bit memory controller, and with a 128-bit bus, it means that 4 of these memory chips can be used. For 8GB capacity, Nvidia had to use 4 double-density 2GB chips, but for a 16GB capacity, they can't simply use 4GB GDDR6 chips because they don't exist. Rather, what they've had to do is use Micron's clamshell configuration, which basically requires a complete PCB redesign. Now, the clamshell configuration allows for the use of 2 memory modules on a single 32-bit memory controller, but this configuration doesn't allow all of the chips to be placed on the front side of the PCB. Rather, half of the chips are positioned on the back side of the PCB, directly adjacent to the chips on the front side, hence the clamshell name. Now, when asked about why the 16GB version of the 4060 Ti costs $100 US more than the standard 8GB model, Nvidia told us that the clamshell method of expanding memory is quite complicated and therefore costly. So that, coupled with the cost of 4 additional 2GB chips, is how they got to $100 US. Seems a little far-fetched to us, but in any case, Nvidia is charging $500 US for the 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti, and that's likely going to be a major problem for this product. The main issue being, other than the extra VRAM, there's no other difference between the 8GB and 16GB versions of the RTX 4060 Ti, which is a good thing in the sense that they both share the same product name, so they should be the same, but it's bad in the sense that for most of today's games, performance will be the same. Ideally, you want to arm a $400 product like the 8GB RTX 4060 Ti with a larger VRAM buffer than what we got 5 years ago on a $380 GTX 1070 for a few reasons. Firstly, having ample VRAM ensures that the latest and greatest games run as they should, optimized or not. And many of this year's newly released games, such as The Last of Us Part 1, did run well on 16GB graphics cards when they were first released, like the Radeon RX 6800, while they were a complete mess on 8GB cards. Granted, that particular game has seen about a dozen patches now and is in much better condition, but games releasing in an unoptimized state, that's nothing new. It's been happening for decades now, and it will continue to happen. It's also very clear now that games are moving beyond 8GB of VRAM, as game developers have publicly stated that they're tired of optimizing for 8GB cards at the high end, and future games will see 8GB graphics cards as more of a low-quality 1080p type solution. And given that, buying an expensive graphics card today with just 8GB of VRAM is almost certainly going to end in tears. Moreover, we don't want future games to be held back or limited by 8GB graphics cards. Sure, we want them to work and scale well on 8GB graphics cards, but we also want to see high and ultra settings offering a next level visual experience with textures that take advantage of 16GB and larger memory buffers. So a 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti is a good thing, but again, the problem is the price. And as it stands right now, Nvidia's most affordable current generation GPU to offer more than 8GB of VRAM costs $500 US. That's an absurd situation to find ourselves in mid-2023. And the thing is, Nvidia themselves know that the RTX 4060 Ti sucks. They know that the 8GB version is an extremely weak offering at $400 US, and they know you know, mostly because you haven't bought it. They also know that the 16GB version is a complete joke, and I'm willing to bet they likely even regret making it, evidenced by the fact that there was no review program for the 16GB model, official or otherwise. There's also no Founders Edition version, and apart from the official announcement a few months back, Nvidia's made no mention of the 16GB version, and it's not just Nvidia who knows the product sucks, their partners are all painfully aware as well, with some even yet to release a 16GB model, and none of them, I repeat, none of them were willing to send us a sample. So that made me one of the probably very few people who ordered one when they went on sale just a few days ago, and I picked it up on release day and got testing immediately. But that does mean that I've only had a few days to test this thing out, so think of this as more of a preview, though to be fair, I think we're going to learn everything we need to with the testing done here. Something I did want to address with this content though was the concern that the 128-bit wide memory bus wouldn't be enough to utilize 16GB of VRAM. I've seen this comment a lot from viewers over the past few months. I'm not sure where it comes from or what the exact theory is, but I think the belief seems to be that there's simply not enough memory bandwidth to effectively use a 16GB memory buffer. So let's start by looking into that. All testing in this video has been conducted on our Ryzen 7 7800X 3D test system with 32GB of DDR5 6000 memory using the latest display drivers. Okay, so first up we're going to look at The Last of Us Part 1, but before I compare the 8GB and 16GB models, here's a look at the 8GB model using the previous version of the game and now the latest version of the game. And as you can see, a lot of those stuttering issues have been cleared up, so it is working a lot better on the 8GB card, certainly a lot more playable, but it isn't actually fixed yet, at least if you want to play at 1440p using the ultra quality settings on an 8GB graphics card. You will get a lot more performance with the 16GB model, or at least a bit more performance, like what we're seeing here. There are instances where it's up to about 15% faster. So although the stuttering issues are largely resolved, again, the 16GB model is up to 15% faster. It's not exactly an apples to apples comparison here, but I have made those comparisons and we'll look at that data a bit later on. And one thing to note here, interestingly in this test, the 8GB card did clock down slightly compared to the 16GB card. We didn't see that in most of my tests. It's only about a 1.5% frequency discrepancy, so that isn't going to account for the large difference we are seeing in performance. And just lastly, whereas you can see the 8GB card is limited to about 7.3GB of memory usage, we're seeing about 10.5GB on the 16GB model. Okay, next up we have Resident Evil 4 using the maximum quality preset at 1080p. And while this did run on the 8GB card, we did see frequent stuttering. There's a few little frame spikes there on the 16GB card, but mostly a smooth frame time graph. And there are clearly some much larger spikes to be seen on the 8GB card. And of course, that is also reflected in the 1% lows. And again, the overall frame rate is significantly higher on the 16GB card. It's having to do a lot less data shuffling. Again, we see just shy of 8GB of VRAM usage on the 8GB card, whereas we're seeing over 11GB of usage on the 16GB card. And that is just helping stabilize the frame rate, resulting in a higher frame rate and, of course, better 1% lows. If we were to dial down the quality settings a bit, that would help out the 8GB card. And if we could get memory usage closer to that 8GB limit, then the performance between these two cards would be much the same. Next up, we have the Callisto protocol. Again, 1080p with the ultra quality settings and ray tracing has been enabled. Again, the 16GB model is faster despite the fact that nothing else has changed apart from the VRAM buffer. We are seeing much more consistent frame time performance. And once we fill up the 8GB buffer on the 8GB model, you can see that the frame time graph just goes to hell there. Massive stuttering, completely unplayable, and the frame rate itself completely tanks. Whereas we're well over 60 FPS on the 16GB model, around the 80 to 90 FPS range. And that just goes to show how limited the 4060 Ti can be by that 8GB VRAM buffer. You do not want to see situations where the card could be producing around 90 FPS, but it's limited, well, it's unplayable because it runs out of VRAM. Then next up, we have a Plague Tale Requiem at 1080p using the ultra quality preset with ray tracing enabled. And this was pretty unplayable on the 8GB card. Very poor 1% low performance. You can see the frame time graph. There's a bit of a mess, and the average frame rate is dragged right down as a result, especially once we start to really run out of VRAM. Completely unplayable. And with the 16GB card, we're seeing around 60 FPS, sometimes above 60 FPS, and a very smooth, consistent frame time graph. So a much better result there with the extra 8GB of VRAM. Now, here's a look at Halo Infinite. This game did run well on both models. This is the 8GB card. You can see the frame rate's quite high and the frame time graph's quite consistent, but the trees, they don't look quite right. We're missing a lot of textures on rocks. You can see some of the ground has texture, but the rocks don't. The shrubs certainly don't. And this is about half an hour of gameplay. We run out of VRAM. But with the 16GB model, we play for over half an hour here. And as you can see, everything is still loaded as it should be. There's no muddy, missing textures. Everything looks as it should. So that is good to see. And the frame rate is what you'd expect to see. And here's just confirmation that we are running just at 1080p, which was the case previously. Ultra quality settings at 1080p. And that allows for you to have all your textures with a 16GB card, which is great to see. I know a lot of you have complained with 8GB cards in Halo Infinite. So it's a game I finally looked into, and I can confirm using those ultra quality settings is a problem for those of you with 8GB graphics cards. And last up, we have Forspoken. This is using the ultra high quality preset, which enables ray tracing, and this is on the 8GB card. You can see the ground there, very washed out, muddy looking, flat, no textures or very few textures. You can see some parts of the game, the textures have loaded, other parts they're missing. And something I noticed with the more recent version of the game is the texture swapping it does. So some surfaces will be textured correctly, others won't. And it also does a lot of texture swapping. So if we look down at the ground now, most of the textures are there. It's not the high. You can see they phased out and then phased back in. So it's struggling to load all the textures, and it's not full texture detail, but it's an improvement over what we saw originally in the game. There you go. If we look up, look back down, you can see the textures slowly load in. So a very suboptimal experience here with the 8GB card, despite the fact that frame time performance and performance in general is very good, but you're just missing the textures. So the visual presentation looks quite poor. Now with the 16GB card, you can see how much sharper, how much more detailed, how much better the textures look. It's a much better looking game with a 16GB graphics card, and the RTX 4060 Ti 16GB is demonstrating that really well. Again, performance is good. We're seeing consistent frame time performance, but just detailed textures everywhere we look. There's no swapping of textures. There's no downgraded textures. The game is being presented as it should be. So that's great to see. It's just a shame that this isn't the standard configuration for an RTX 4060 Ti. Okay, so here's a look at The Last of Us Part 1 using the same quality settings we just looked at for the live gameplay footage. Using the ultra quality settings at 1080p, we found the 16GB model is 16% faster on average. So the 1% lows, they were boosted by as much as 25%. So a big performance jump here, resulting in 6700 XT-like performance. And it's a similar story at 1440p. Here, the 16GB model was 24% faster on average, with a 32% boost to 1% lows, allowing it to basically match the 6700 XT. Now here's a look at a Plague Tale Requiem using the ultra quality settings but without ray tracing enabled, which doesn't exceed an 8GB VRAM buffer. The end result is identical performance between the 8 and 16GB models at 1080p, and we're also looking at basically the same thing at 1440p with no more than a few frames in it. Cyberpunk 2077 was tested using the high quality preset, and here the 16GB model offered a very minor performance bump, though 1% lows were improved by 9%, but the average frame rate was much the same. There's even less of a difference seen at 1440p, where the 16GB model was just 1 to 2 FPS faster. Forza Horizon 5 saw identical performance from both models at 1080p and 1440p, so clearly this title was not in need of extra VRAM. And this is what you can expect to see in most games, as right now most games don't require more than 8GB of VRAM. In this example, we tested Resident Evil 4 using the second highest quality preset, which greatly reduces VRAM usage, and as a result, the 8 and 16GB versions of the RTX 4060 Ti delivered basically the same level of performance at both tested resolutions. Spider-Man Remastered did see a small performance improvement with the extra VRAM, boosting the average frame rate by 5%, though in the grand scheme of things this is a negligible performance difference, and similar margins were also seen at 1440p, so while the 16GB model is faster, it's not faster by a noteworthy margin. Now here's a quick look at power. The 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti is still very power efficient, as doubling the VRAM capacity only increases the TDP by 5 watts. Of course, in some instances, the GPU is able to work a bit harder with the extra VRAM, like what we saw in Spider-Man Remastered, so here the total system usage increased by 7%. Hitman 3 though saw no performance improvements with the additional VRAM, so here power usage is much the same. In fact, we're seeing exactly a 5 watt increase. And finally, here's a quick look at the 15-game average data. The 16GB model is just 4% faster on average, which makes sense as most of the games saw no performance change. We're also looking at just a 3% improvement at 1440p, because again, most of the games tested saw no real performance change, and a lot of the more demanding games were tested using dialed down quality settings, which is done to allow for more playable frame rates on the mainstream models. So there you have it, the 16GB VRAM buffer. It certainly works, and it does make the RTX 4060 Ti a much better product in my view, and I'm confident in years to come that this version will hold up reasonably well, offering RTX 3070-like performance without the VRAM limitations. And yeah, look, it still has a 128-bit wide memory bus, but as we saw in the memory-hungry examples, that doesn't stop the GPU from utilizing the 16GB buffer to avoid performance-related issues. Of course, the real issue with the 4060 Ti is the price, and that applies to both variants. The 8GB model, that should cost $300, so a $100 discount, and ideally $350 for the 16GB version, or at the absolute most, maybe $400, so the current asking price of the 8GB version. But $500 for what should be the base configuration RTX 4060 Ti is insane. It's also insane that for gamers wanting more than 8GB of VRAM from a current generation GeForce GPU have to spend $500 US. And sadly, AMD doesn't look to be coming to the rescue either. The current rumor suggests that the 7700 XT will offer 12GB and the 7800 XT 16GB, and that both will arrive in September. But pricing won't be great there, and I don't expect that the 7700 XT will be a sub $500 product, so the current VRAM issues will continue. As for the 16GB RTX 4060 Ti, obviously you shouldn't buy it at $500 US, $400 maybe, but I don't expect it to hit that price anytime soon. I, for one, though, am extremely thankful that Nvidia released a 16GB version of the RTX 4060 Ti, as it's going to provide us with loads of great content opportunities over the next few years. It's going to be very interesting to monitor how the 8GB and 16GB versions track with future games. For now, though, it's a horribly priced graphics card that you can ignore, and that is going to do it for this video. If you enjoyed this one, do give it a thumbs up. I'll probably do a bit more detailed benchmarking and investigation with this product in the coming weeks. But yeah, this is my initial review/preview. Just a quick look at it, see if the 16GB VRAM buffer does help with those previous issues that we found, and yeah, it certainly does. Anyway, yeah, as I said, enough on this one. Do that, subscribe, because yeah, there'll be more stuff coming up worth watching, and probably more GPU reviews in the not too distant future. Also, if you'd like to become a Hardware Unboxed community member, we have Patreon, Floatplane. Either of those will give you access to some pretty cool stuff. We have an exclusive Discord server, monthly live streams, behind the scenes content, and Q&A. So check that out if you're interested. If not, that's perfectly fine. And I would like to thank you for watching this video. I'm your host, Steve. See you again next time.